My name is Sehin Teferra, and I'm the founder and current director of Setaweet NGO, which is the civil society wing of Setaweet movement, a feminist movement here in Ethiopia. Setaweet was founded 7 years ago, and a lot of our work has been around gender-based violence. But now with the opening of the political space, we're kind of shyly and quite carefully getting into leadership work. So we work with some of the major political parties, helping them engender their political statements, their policies. We offer trainings for women candidates, but also for men. So that's kind of our participation with informal politics. And of course, in terms of informal politics, we're leaders within the civil society movement when it comes to gender work, and we're one of the few feminist civil society organizations working in the country. We had a political transformation process start 3 years ago, following some major unrests that really lasted about 4 years. So we've had a change, not in government, but in leadership. We have a new prime minister now, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, and he's ushered in some reforms, and including the leading political party. He's created a new political party that's kind of taken over where the older party was, and he's opened up the space. So the political space is opened now to civil society, which was very closed and really repressive in the past. Media has been liberalized. Some of the repressive laws against women, against people really have been, they're being revised. And most importantly, opposition political parties have been invited back into the country. A lot of them were in exile. They've been invited back into the country to take part in elections. And we're hoping, the scheduled election will be in June. June 5th will be when we'll have national elections. Well, if without the opening up of the political space, we wouldn't even have managed to register as an NGO, as a civil society organization, because that was quite difficult to do in the past. It would take up to or over 2 years to simply register, and we wouldn't have been allowed to work in a lot of the political areas where we work now. So the opening up has been huge for us. But it also means we can work with political parties. So we can have an election that has a fair chance of being fair and civil. We're hoping, although everybody's worried that there'll be violence as well. But it's meant a huge deal. That doesn't mean we don't still have problems. We have huge problems, particularly around security and conflict in many parts of the country, including the north, so in Tigray. So it's difficult, but we're still cautiously hopeful that we're really moving out of the dark days. Our work with political parties is quite early. It's only really now that political parties are registering as it is. We worked with one major political party in preparing them for working with them to develop a gender policy, and we've done a series of trainings for them. It's a major political opposition party, and another one has approached us recently, and we're planning to do the kind of similar services, to offer similar services to that political party. But that's about it when it comes to our engagement with formal politics, because again, it's all kind of new. But we're founding members of a new coalition of organizations working on gender democratization. So it's Setaweet, Newa, and a couple of other organizations, some even younger than young Setaweet. So it's exciting, but it also means we can share resources and avoid duplication, which often happens with civil society organizations. So that's really exciting for us. But some of our other work that Setaweet is really known for is around campaigning. We've had some really impactful campaigns, and the main one I think would be What She Wore, the What She Wore exhibits in Millavsana Bernam Park, which is really, really powerful. You can see a poster of it in the back behind me. So it started in Addis with an exhibit of the outfits worn by sexual violence survivors, the outfit that they were wearing at the time of their rape. So it was just really impactful in starting conversations around victim blaming, because obviously the first question that police officer or many other people would ask is, what was she wearing at the time? So it was really powerful, and it was so impactful that it traveled to a few cities in Ethiopia, 3 cities, and it would have gone further, but we had to stop it due to Corona, and we had a closing ceremony recently, a few months back here in Addis. So that was that, but we've had other campaigns as well around acid attacks. We've had a specific campaign on sexual violence victims, somebody who died after having acid thrown at her and having been allegedly raped. So we had a campaign around her, trying to demand for justice on that case. And we've had other more fun campaigns as well around fatherhood. Arifa Bat was a campaign we had on positive masculinity, on positive images of fatherhood, and that kind of thing. Apart from that, we have the gender shops, which was very kindly supported by Womankind, which is a curriculum for secondary school students, provided to about 2,000 students here in Addis. And we're hoping to have a second edition of it outside Addis. So that's one. We have feminist circles at universities that we work with. We had a women-only academic conference last year that grew into an all-women academic journal coming out in a few weeks. I think you have gender stereotypes everywhere in the world, but I think where they're really dangerous in Ethiopia is how much they're tied to violence. Violence is something that's very much on our minds. We run a hotline for sexual violence survivors, and it's quite despairing, the level of violence that women and particularly children experience in Ethiopia. And there's very little support in the way of counseling or even proper legal system to make sure that perpetrators always get that justice is always served. So for me, that would be the main thing. That would be the main concern. It's not just that women are considered as less, which they are. It's very much embedded in Ethiopianness. It's very much embedded in our language and the culture. Everything is kind of conspires to keep women at a certain place, which is annoying by itself, but it's also very dangerous when it's viewed with violence as it is. So that's a major concern for us, and that's why we work so much on victim blaming, because a lot of what causes violence is the fact that victims are blamed and they're really afraid to come forward. We see this every day in our work, so that's why it's a major part of our work. But there's a few NGOs that have done rapid assessments. I'm trying to remember who it was, but recently I read a report, a rapid response assessment into increased cases of violence in Addis because of COVID. So definitely, and even if the data is not there to see, it's quite predictable that whenever you have a crisis, people get frustrated, or we didn't actually have a lockdown, but there was definitely reduced economic activity, and that always has the impact of causing men or allowing men to hurt women and girls and boys. So even before there was kind of any announcement by the government, Setaweet moved our work online, and we were able to do that quite quickly. So now we have maybe one person coming in every day to open the office, and the rest of the time we're working remotely, and it's worked out well. The hotline that we're running used to be out of our office, and we have a nice space set up for it. But with the Corona crisis, we've been able to move it online. So people are able to get counseling on the phone, basically. counselors are able to take calls and provide frontline counseling on the phone. So that's one major thing which shifted. A lot of our messaging, particularly in introducing the hotline, has been COVID friendly. So we have messaging around people kind of being stuck indoors, and perhaps that would be, we can see a rise in both economic but also physical violence. So some of our work has been around that messaging. We've developed a policy brief on gender and the COVID response, because it's been very difficult to input gender considerations into COVID, just because it's so new. It's new not just to Ethiopia, but everywhere in the world. But we have some ideas on how such a response can be better gender sensitive, and we've developed a policy brief around that, and should be published soon, in a week or something. Well, I think it's always important to have a gender responsive or response to anything, really. With COVID, it's quite difficult because it's so new, but it's also not the first pandemic we've had, but it's also not, and also not the first kind of natural disaster. So you'd think by now that the world knows how to build gender into responses, but it hasn't been the case. I think there's changes, and I know some of the NGOs that participate in the COVID task force, they've tried to push for a gender sensitive approach. So for example, we don't have them anymore, but when we had isolation centers, there was some work around making sure there's sanitary products, for example, because a lot of the people in isolation centers would be women, to have a separate room for nursing mothers. So all these things you kind of take for granted until somebody remembers that they actually need to be put in place. So that's been done, and in any case, we don't have isolation centers anymore. Well, the entire effort is led by a woman, because we have a woman health minister, Dr. Leah Taddas, and she's really great. And there's obviously other women on the task force as well. As you know, Ethiopia has a nearly equal gender equal cabinet. It's, I think, 46% women now. So that's really great. So by default, women are leading the response. I think we could invest more in gender responsive pandemic responses, and that's always the case. But you do see women coming together, and it's always the case. So not even just in terms of formal leadership, but women forming community groups. There was a lot of work around raising money and particularly goods for people in poorer neighborhoods. When we thought there would be a lockdown, we didn't end up having a lockdown, but with the threat of a lockdown, there was a lot of community efforts to support other communities, and a lot of that was raised by women, recognizing that women obviously bear the brunt of COVID to a large degree, and other women really understanding this and raising funds to do that. So that was really great. As in anything, as with everything, it's always, women bear the brunt. They do a lot of community work to help themselves and to help other women, but it's not always recognized in terms of formal leadership. So there's quite a disconnect between what women do and what they're recognized to be doing. It came about because the Prime Minister decided on gender parity. It didn't come from any sort of push by civil society, although obviously civil society is always asked for better representation. So it's great, but it feels very, I don't know what's the proper English word for it. It feels very ephemeral. Like, is that the word? Like it could be lost anytime, because our ministers, as great as it is to have them, are there by appointment. And we don't have a lot of career politicians in Ethiopia, certainly very few career politicians who are women. So this feels like it's something we could lose any time. And of course, the struggle is always that when women are appointed, they're not necessarily beholden to a women's rights movement that didn't get them there. I know in some countries that's the trend, and I think it's more sustainable than having women kind of come up by appointments. But in any case, this is what we have, and it's great in addressing stereotypes for sure. Because you can look at women in very powerful places and you get used to it. And little girls who grow up watching that, they find it to be the new normal. So it's very important. I'd never want to say it's not important. But just the hard work is in making sure this takes root and it's not something that's just here now. And next time the Prime Minister decides that he doesn't want a gender equal cabinet, then we lose this parity. That would be a tragedy. We have to be careful to not assume that having women in places of power means better policies for women. That's not always the case. I wish we had more feminists in power. We don't. But I can give you an example of what is changing and what's giving me a lot of hope. So it's not so much within the cabinet, which as you know is almost 50% women, but other appointments. So the chair of the election board is a woman, as you know, and the chair of the Supreme Court is a woman. And when you have a feminist in that place, as the chair of the Supreme Court, what you have is an added attention given to cases of violence against women and children. So that's something that's really giving us a lot of hope. And we've very recently, as actually last week, signed an MOU with the Supreme Court to try to do more work around violence. And it's really the first time that we've had the courts, that we've seen the courts pay particular attention to violence against women. So that's great. That's one example of having a woman in power, having a feminist woman in power, and the change in legislation. Feminist leader would be for me, somebody who leads everyone. Obviously, she's not. I know when Maza Ashanafi was appointed as the Supreme Court chair, people reminded her, now you're everybody's leader. You're not just the leader of women. But I also remember her saying, yes, but I'm not going to forget my focus. Something that I've struggled for the last 20, 30 years, which is the rights of women and girls. So I think bringing that focus in, always looking at, asking where are the women, not just in terms of parity and not just in terms of numbers, but how does this affect women and how does this affect girls in particular ways? So an example would be the COVID response. So I'm not waiting for civil society to point out, these are the ways in which women and girls are affected differently. So just that eye towards the difference between women and men would be the first thing for me. I think a second aspect of feminist leadership would just be to listen, to be non-hierarchical, to really kind of respect all viewpoints, even those that are not feminist, and to try to bring in a high level of emotional intelligence towards one's work. That's obviously a tall order. It's not something that I always manage to do, but it's definitely an aspiration. Well, I think the first one would be to just be there, to just be an example. And it's incredibly empowering because you can't be what you don't see. So it's very, very important that we have a woman president, for example, because now you hear a lot of little girls saying they want to grow up to be president, which is really unheard of. When I was growing up, I couldn't imagine a woman president. So that's huge. That would be one. But the second thing would be to always ask oneself, how is what I'm doing now uplifting other women? How is this creating opportunity? Not just for me to shine, but how am I creating the opportunity for other women to shine? So, for example, among feminists in Addis, we have a loose coalition where if one of us is invited to speak at a certain thing and we can't make it, we make sure it's another woman, and not just another woman, but another feminist who gets invited to the spot, because it's really important that we're visible, not just visible for ourselves, but actually creating the space and holding the space for other women to step in as well, because it closes so fast. And always protesting when it's not enough women. If I'm the only woman in the room, it's actually something to be scared of, and to be and to protest rather than to find it as something good. Feminism is these two things that we've just spoken about. For me, I think the first is always like never forgetting to ask where the women are, and never taking on that gender lens to say, how does this affect me as a woman? How does it affect other women? And the second part, equally important, is to stand up for other women, to stand up for all kinds of women, and not just women like me. And I think that's hugely important, to be intersectional, and to stand up for women who I really have nothing in common with except being a woman. I think kind of for me that's the ultimate test of being a feminist. No, thanks for this, and we really appreciate the support of Womankind throughout all these years. I think a major focus for me, in particular on the topic of power, would be where Ethiopia is heading now, because we're really at a crossroads, and particularly with the conflict both in Tigray and in Benishangul and many places, it's had such a gendered impact that not many people are talking about. Setaweet hosted an open session a couple of weeks back, a public discussion on exactly this, on how conflicts are affecting women and girls in very specific ways, and particularly around sexual violence. So very little attention being given to the government to this. So that's it's really high on our minds, and it's very hard to think about other things when you have a war going on. It kind of stalls everything and makes everything so much less important. And last week, the Minister of Women, Children and Youth gave a statement about rape, and it's really the first time that the government has acknowledged that rape is happening, and that was a big deal. So we're encouraged, but at the same time, it's just so much more needs to be done before we can even think about equality and dealing with stereotypes and all these other kind of things that we do as feminists. None of them seem very timely when we're in active conflict and women and girls are experiencing really horrific things.